Having listened and watched the videos done at Morisset in 2010, I thought that I would do a number of videos about my own experience at Glacier View since I was there. I've pretty much come to terms with Glacier View, though you might not think so because here I am speaking about it. But I realise that every person lives in their own little world and experiences the same events differently. I'm very interested in history. I've studied it at university, at tertiary level, and I realise how important it is to leave a record and how important documents and diaries are. If you don't record what happened, in one sense it never happened. And I wish now that I'd written an intensive diary at the time of Glacier View, but I didn't. I'm writing for posterity. It's just one viewpoint for which I am entirely responsible. My husband has read this, and some of it I left out because he thought I should. My experience of Glacier View and that of others would be somewhat different, and I emphasise that it's just one view. I'm writing particularly in response to things that Dr. Young says on the 4th Morisset video. There are lots of good things that he says, and I'm only commenting on some of it. The 5th video of Des was put up by Phil Butler on his YouTube page after I wrote the script. And Des covers some of the things that I said. In fact, I was grateful for that because I wasn't always sure that what I said was accurate. Now, being a woman, I can't think in a straight line, and so there's some wondering as I describe the background and what I saw as key issues. Just think of Ezekiel 1 and the wheels that went round and round and it turned in many directions. So what I'm doing is a micro-history, the sort of thing a woman would write, not a man. In the end, I'll state where I see things differently to Norman, who was also at Glacier View, where I think the other participants of the Morisset meetings were not. He was there, he participated there in some sense more than I did because he was on the committees. He has a highly competent view of what happened there. It's some details where I would disagree, and it comes from a difference in experience. I'm doing this from memory, and memory, especially after nearly 40 years, is often faulty because the mind embellishes events with later thoughts. So this is a biased view, but I was a witness to some things that others were not. For instance, the Friday afternoon meeting with Prexad and members of the Australasian Division. In my memory, Elder Pastor Keith Parmenter and Arthur Duffy, now both deceased, were present representing the SPD. I did write a list of who was there after the meetings. I did a drawing of where each person was sitting, and Des and I both made notes immediately after the meeting, and all of this I gave to Milton Hook when he was doing his biography, and he put all that information with much else in Avondale archives. So I don't have this information to hand. The outcome of Glacier View was no surprise to us. It was a result of Des's emphatic preaching on the issue of righteousness by faith for over a decade, a view that countered the traditional view of the sinful nature of Christ and perfectionism, and the later debate on the book of Hebrews, a challenge to 1844 and the doctrine of the investigative judgment. Glacier View largely resulted because because of Des's response to the teachings of Robert Brinsmead about 1844 and the investigative judgment in mid-1979. In July 1979, Bob published his book 1844 Re-Examined. And if you read the Wikipedia article on Bob, it gives a good outline of his history. In summer of that same year, 1979, Des was given 3 months off to research and write his book Crisis, his 2-volume commentary on the book of Revelation. And just before, or maybe just at the beginning of that time, he went to the Library of Congress, and I believe he went there for meetings at Washington, D.C., I'm not sure. But he also went to the Library of Congress, and he was able to handle and read many commentaries that use the principles of historicism and were written for their specific times. And so they used the information, Reformation, and applied it to their own times, and often saw themselves in the last days. For instance, in the time of Luther, it was believed that he was preaching the 3 angels' messages. And through the ages, Christians have looked at the book of Revelation and they've tended to do this. They've applied it, the events in the book, to things that happened in their time. And Des realised more strongly that this is what Adventists did in the 19th century. They had looked at what was happening in their times and applied it to the book of Revelation. Des said to me while writing this book, Crisis, that it could cost him his job because it didn't teach traditional Adventism. The work Des did on Crisis, the October 1979 Forum, and the Glacier View manuscript were all written with the intent to make the Church's eschatological views more biblical, more Christ-centred, and to bring the denomination into the modern age. As Graham Bradford stated, Des was trying to help the Church advance, but of course it was not viewed that way. And Des was not alone. Other scholars saw much of what Des saw. Now, in the 1960s, Robert Brinsmead had taught perfectionism and ultra-traditional Adventism, but he changed his views after he decided to debate a Roman Catholic priest in the early 1970s. The Pope was coming to Australia at the time, and through his preparation for this event, which did not take place, Bob realised that traditional Adventism, with its belief in perfectionism, was similar to Roman Catholic doctrine, the Tridentine view from the Council of Trent. Catholics believed that the word justification meant make righteous, while the Reformers, as most later scholars, believed it meant declared righteous on the basis of Christ's finished work. Now, Des had previously urged Bob to read Luther's writings, and as a result of the proposed debate that did not take place, he did read Luther, and he radically changed his views, and as a result of this, he joined up with Dr. Geoffrey Paxton, an Anglican professor who wrote The Shaking of Adventism in 1977. Through Bob's journal, Verdict, he had a huge influence not only on Adventists, but on evangelicals as well. And then about a decade later, Bob did another about-face and became a liberal Christian. As a background to Glacier View, people need to understand that Des had been constantly under scrutiny by right-wing traditionalists. In the 1970s, he was called to the Australasian division 2 or 3 times to answer questions, sometimes in a very public way. Lots of departmental heads were there, as well as his opponents. I remember 3 visits to the division. Des is not sure. Each time, Des was vindicated. Now, the traditional Adventists were upset with Des over a number of issues. Roman Catholicism as the beast of Revelation. They believed that Des was too soft on the Catholics. Another view was that Turkey was the king of the north, and this old teaching, long forgotten and now relegated to the Adventist trash can, was still a favourite of retired ministers in Australia, such as Pastor George Burnside. Pastor Burnside called Des Antichrist, who lived near Avondale, and when told in his final years that he might have a heart attack if he kept on getting so angry about Des, he said he couldn't think of a better way to go. Another view taught by the traditionalists was about Christ entering into the first and second compartments of the heavenly sanctuary, entry into the second in 1844. And this doctrine had been somewhat replaced by two-phase ministry taught by Heppenstall. Anyway, for a number of reasons, these men were after Des, and Des summed up some of their behaviour and teaching as barely Christian, and that is strong language for Des. A key doctrine among most Adventists was a belief in the sinful nature of Christ. Jesus had a sinful nature like us. He kept the law, and so can we, and we have to be perfect by the time of probation's end. In this scenario, justification means making righteousness. We are forgiven for our past sins at conversion. But then we muscle up to keep the law perfectly for the rest of our lives. The names of those living since 1844 come up for judgment as God goes through his books to look at the sins of believers. This overview reflects the thinking of traditional Adventists and was brought to the global church attention with the Sabbath School pamphlet of Herbert Douglas on the nature of Christ. I believe it was in 1973. Herb Douglas, Kenneth Wood, who was editor of the Review at the time, Elder Robert Pearson, who was the president of the General Conference, and Willis Hackett. I'm not sure what he did, but these men believed in the traditional views, and there were many others like them.